Welcome back to my studio and a new video. Today I'm going to show you how I made my corset for my Ariel Ball Gown. So let's get started. To start out, I used Truly Victorian's pattern 110 for a Victorian corset, and I cut this pattern pieces out on denim, followed by silk, and lastly cotton. I pinned and then using a basting stitch, I flatlined every piece of denim to the silk dupioni to create a stronger structured fashion fabric. I press every piece so that it will lay flat, but also to strengthen the stitches in the silk dupioni. Now I mark all of the pieces. I mark the denim side and then I do the cotton pieces as well. And these markings are going to help me line up my corset pieces when I start to pin them and sew them together. Now it's time to pin the pieces together, and I do this right sides together, and I start at the marked piece and I work my way up and down. On a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, I sew my pieces together, right sides together, and I do this for every single piece throughout the entire panel. Now's the time to take out the tailor's ham. I love this tool and I use it to press open all of the seams and around all of the curves. A ham is a really useful tool to have, and especially for corsetry, and I absolutely love how I can get all of my seams really flat, especially around the hip and the bust curves. Once my seams are pressed flat, I'm going to pin them down. These are going to become the boning channels for my corset. This is my preferred method of adding boning channels, but if you need to add more, you can also add ribbon in between the panels. Now I'm going to sew those pieces down very slowly using a 3mm stitch. My goal with this is to not wrinkle my fabric at all, so I typically take this step slow. Once again, I'm going to press out all of my seams. When in doubt, press it out. Now it's time to add boning. I have an entire video on how to pick boning for corsetry, and for this corset I do use synthetic whalebone, and I measure it by holding it alongside the channel, and then I take off an inch on each side, or a half an inch depending on the binding I'm going to add. I believe I did 3/4 of an inch on each side for this corset, and then I sand down the edges using a nail file, or a nail file is what I ended up using, and then I can add the boning to the channel, and I repeat this for every channel. Once all my boning is added, I will mark my busk placement, and I'm doing this on my cotton right now because I'm going to pin it and sew the cotton onto the silk. So I'm actually marking it on the cotton so that you won't be able to see it from the top. And it's really important to figure out where you're going to place your busk and figure out the 1/2 inch from the top to the bottom, and then place your markings before you actually try to sew it in, because you want to make sure it's going to line up in the end. And since I've marked everything, now I'm going to pin the cotton to the silk right sides together. And then the next step you will see, I will actually be sewing it, and I will sew it, and then I will backstitch, pick it up and sew it to the other side so that it creates little notches for the busk to be placed into. So now I'm going to try to place all of the the busk notches into the case that I just sewn. This part's a little difficult for me and I struggle bust my way through it. But once you get through this, then I flip it over and I will hold it and pin it in place so that I can actually sew around it, and that will keep it in place. And once it's there, it's done, it's stuck, and then you just have to do the other side. Now I'm going to use the placed half of the busk to mark where the other half of the busk will go so that I can create holes in the proper placement so that they will line up when I sew it all in. I will now pin the cotton right sides together so that I can sew it in, and then this will be able to create the casing for the second half of the busk, just like we did on the first half of the busk. Using my awl, I'm going to poke a hole in my silk dupioni so that I can place the busk piece into it, and then I try to hold this in place until I get all the way through the holes. Now that the busk is in all the holes, we're going to do exactly what we did on the opposite side and pin the 2 layers of fabric around it to create a casing. From here, we will sew it. I actually sew my busk in with a zipper foot so that I have I won't accidentally sew over the metal. And you'll see that right here. It's just got my little zipper foot, and then I just use that to guide along the sewing. Now that all of our hardware is in place, it's time to sew everything up so that none of those bones fall out, and to clean up the edges. So I'm just going to pin around the entire edge, top and bottom. And once I make it to the top, I'm actually also going to pin the lace decoration on the top. This is just something I did because I thought it would look a little pretty and cute, but it's definitely not necessary for a corset. However, I try to be as extra as I can every step of the way. And then I sew all of this down, still with my zipper foot in place, using a 4mm stitch, since I'm going to put binding over the top and bottom next. I don't use a super close stitch for this. Let's make some binding. Using my Quilters Select 3-inch ruler, I actually just trace around this ruler until I get the length that I have desired for this piece. Since I'm cutting through 2 pieces of fabric here, it's technically going to be 2 pieces of binding, and then I will actually, in the next step, cut down the center of it. So it's going to be 1.5 inch wide total, so 4 strips of 1.5 inch wide bias binding, and I am cutting this on an angle, which is cutting it on the binding. And again, I use my Quilters Select ruler to line up the top at a 45-degree angle to find this bias cut. I prefer to make binding because I like my binding to match the garment, and sometimes I actually like to have it contrast the garment. In this case, I wanted it to match, but it matches perfectly and I like the way it looks, so I made it. Once all of my binding is cut, I actually take to my iron and I will fold my binding strips in half because we are making double fold bias tape instead of single fold. I'll fold them in half and then I will fold them in quarters from there. And I'll start with the top and then I will flip it over and do the bottom. And I also use this as a chance to press it completely on the both sides. So I'll press through all of it. Then I will pin 1/4 of it to my corset, and I'm actually going to machine sew this part down. And once this part has been machine sewn down, I try to do this on about a 3mm stitch. Once it's sewn, I will flip it over to the inside of my corset and I'll pin it, and then I actually use a slip stitch or a whip stitch to stitch it down by hand. I used to stitch in the ditch for corsets, and I would have to redo the binding all the time because of the way it looked, and I just think this looks cleaner and prettier, and it is more historically accurate. The last step is grommets. So we're going to mark our grommet placement on the inside of the corset, like you see here, and typically the grommet placement is on the pattern piece for the back piece. So I'm going to mark that, and then I'm going to flip it over and I'm going to hole punch it. I'm going to stick my awl through it, and then I use a 1/4 inch grommets. That means that the inside hole is a 1/4 inch. And I have a grommet setter, so I use my rubber mallet and I will hammer the pieces in place. I like to have the top piece on the top side of the fabric and the inner piece on the inside. I think it looks cleaner that way, and sometimes I even go the extra mile and hand embroider around these guys, but I didn't do it for this corset. Thank you so much for watching my video, and if you would like to see more of my sewing work, please feel free to subscribe to the channel, and until next time, happy sewing!